Alright guys, today I'm going to talk about how I sew stripes into headbands. Um, I learned the method that I use from Oliver, like pretty much everything else I know how to sew. But the difference is that for today's video, I'm not going to put the camera next to the ironing board and then put the camera next to the sewing machines, because you guys know how to iron and you know how to sew. I'm just going to show you how to piece together the stripes, and then I'll go and do the other stuff, and then I'll bring it back to the camera and you'll be able to see what I did. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this piece of brown denim, and this is going to be the front panel of the two-piece headband. And for the stripes, I've got a piece of coyote and a piece of green flying skulls. This is already cut, as you can tell. This is not. I've done that on purpose so I can show you how I cut out the stripes, in case you're curious about that as well. This piece of coyote is kind of an extra long stripe. I didn't need this much, but I had this much, and obviously I couldn't do anything with that much, so I just left it intact. And what I want to do is I've put the template on my piece of fabric, and I've kind of put it about center on the fabric because I want to have the luxury of being able to move the template side to side if I don't really like where the stripe is arranged. Normally I like to try to put the stripe pretty close to the tag. I've got a little Sharpie line right here, and then I've got my tag notation that actually is inaccurate. The tag is really like right here, because this is the, anyway, it doesn't really matter. But the tag line is too close to the stripe on my template, and I just haven't fixed it yet. But this is essentially the line that I'm going to follow, except recently I've been doing something a little bit differently. Normally I would put the beginning of the stripe right there, and then of course the stripes will go from like here to here, which is not going to be terribly accurate, because then I'd have to move the template again to arrange it so the tag is where I want it to be. So instead of drawing a line in the fabric right here, I usually actually draw it about an inch over to the left. It's still not going to be totally accurate in relation to where it's going to be in the final panel, but it does give me a little bit more space to work with. So that is what I'm going to do first. I've got my handy dandy ruler right here, and I'm also going to arrange the panel so it's essentially a 1/4 inch above the bottom of the denim. Now, people that we make headbands for are not using compasses to measure the angle of the stripes, so as long as the stripes are uniform, it doesn't really matter whatever angle they are. I just want to keep it kind of consistent because I'm making 12 headbands of different colors, all Sandana striped, for the EXL tournament. So I just want it to be not symmetrical, but consistent at least. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my inch ruler right there. Then I'm going to use my erasable marker, and I'm just going to draw a little line like that. And that is it for that. Now I'm going to move the, got a little bit of a sore throat today, team, so not sounding my usual best, but we will make do. So I've got my ruler right here, and that's where I'm going to draw my, that's where I've drawn my line, so that's where I'm going to cut my line. Whoops. So, easy peasy. Now I can see a couple of things I do want to point out is that you have to be absolutely, I mean, it's not, again, absolutely critical, but what you want to do is you want to pay attention to the weave of the denim, because it is going to affect how your top stitch looks. If you have a denim weave that is, let's say that this was my stripe right here, and you can kind of see that the denim weave would put it so the stripe So the top stitching line would follow the lines of the stripe. When I first started, I thought that that would be a really cool detail to have the weaves kind of lining up. But what happens is that if your sewing is not perfectly accurate, which it's really never going to be, it does mean that if the needle kind of jumps from one line to another and then jumps back to the other line, it is going to make kind of a bulge in the top stitch line. So even if your line is as straight as you can make it, it's not going to look very good if you're trying to follow the lines of the weave. So what I typically do is when I'm lining up my stripes, I put it so it's like something like this. So the weave is wait, what the fuck? So if this is my stripe and I cut it like this, what ends up happening is that the weave is at enough of an angle so the line is going to look pretty straight. Not regardless of how I sew. Obviously, you still have to pay attention to your guidelines and all that stuff, but it is going to go in and look pretty neat. And same thing goes for the stripes. The coyote, I've got the weave to the side, sort of a diagonal lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner, and then the flying skulls will be basically the same as the coyote. So that's just a little side thing just to make the stitching a little bit cleaner. So now that I've got the panel cut, I'm going to move it to the side because I won't need it for a little bit. And I put a little weight on it so it doesn't slip off of my table and get chewed up by my dogs. And this is the in-between stripe that I'm going to use between the coyote and the flying skulls. And what I do for the in-between stripe is that I want to make it pretty narrow, but I don't want to make it a perfect inch, because I've got to think about the seam allowances from the edges. So when I sew them together, then I've got basically a narrow band, and sometimes if the seam allowances are touching each other, then I have to go back and trim them up a little bit so they're separated. But the easier thing to do is just to measure it a little bit wider at first, because when the seam allowances are touching, that means that you can get kind of a bulge when you iron the stripe flat. And when you top stitch through that bulge, sometimes it'll make the seam a little bit wonky. Like it won't be meeting at the middle, it'll be kind of like off center. I can't really describe it very well, but you would know it if you saw it. That's another reason why I make the stripes a little bit longer than I need, because the edges of the stripes, either above the band or below the band, there's just not as much material. So like if you're doing the top stitching on the coyote, for example, and it's just 2 layers and it's kind of hanging off the edge and it wasn't properly ironed, then that top stitch is going to be affected also. So if you have a stripe that's longer than you need, then you can kind of shift the stripe up and down so that you give the best top stitch to the area where the template is going to be covering. You always want to present your best work. You don't want to present the very bottoms of the stripe where the top stitch is kind of curving a little bit perhaps, or just not looking as neat as it could. So I usually start with like a 5 or 6 inch piece of stripe, even though my denim panel is only 4 inches. It just means that I don't have to be as critical on every single measurement, because I know that there is space. So if the stripes are misaligned or one of the edges of the panel is misaligned, then it does mean that I still have space to, reline up the bottom if I need to, draw another template line, cut it out, and I'm okay. I can still make the band. But if you start with just enough stripe and you don't have any excess, it'll be really annoying if you have to either unpick a seam and redo it, or I've even had to throw away bandana stripes because I cut them too short and I couldn't make anything with them, and that's annoying. So anyway, back to me. So what I've got right now is I've got it at 1 inch and 1/8. So it's just a little bit past 1 inch, and I do that again because I want to have the seam allowances separated. I don't want them touching or like overlapping because that's going to make it look awful. So I want to have them separate, but taking up most of the stripe. Because I am using a true 1/4 inch seam on the stripes, it's not going to be like a scant or anything like that with a foot. I am using an actual seam guide. And I do that because the neater you are underneath the stripe, the neater the top stitching will go through, and the neater it will look. That's not news to any of you guys. Good preparation makes for good stripes. So, there it is. Got my denim, my brown denim stripe. I've got my coyote stripe, and I still got a scrap like this. Is I obviously need to decide what side I want to use. This side looks a little bit longer in terms of, you know, interesting parts of the details than this side. I don't really like to get just the edges of the wrap if I can get part of the... you know what? I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to cut it so I can get 5 inches, but I'm going to try and see if I can get the 5 inches from the inside, which will be more pleasing. It does mean that I'm going to waste a little bit of this. Actually, no, I'm not going to do that. That's really dumb because I don't have a lot of this fabric left. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to chop off right there, and then I'm going to measure. So I've got, you know, what I'm doing is I'm just using the seam lines right here to measure where the skull is, because these are for a tournament and they're prizes, and you know, I just want to do a good job because these people have been good to me, so I want to be good to them. So what that means is that when I fold in the seam, that's going to be a really nice layout with the skull kind of appearing. I'm not going to show the whole skull because these are narrow stripes, but they are going to be 1.5 inches. So my stripes are 1.5 inches. The in-between stripes are 1 1/8 inches. Doesn't sound right, but it is. I think it is. So set that off to the side because I'll probably use it again. Okay. So that's one of my stripes. This is the middle stripe. And what I want to do is I want to, first of all, before I go any further, I'm going to arrange the stripes as if they were sewn. And I'm going to imagine how I'm going to put them. Obviously, the coyote is longer, so that's going to give me a little bit more flexibility in terms of layout. So I'd like to get the TM, I'd like to get the snake. So let's see what would happen if I flipped it. And that might be cool. And then what I want to do is I want to just imagine, I want to put the template over the stripe to see if all of that stuff can be shown. And indeed it can. I don't want to put the stripe too low to the bottom because I need to have enough for the allowance on the top, but that's going to be good. Obviously the layout is not going to be identical because when I put in the seams, then it will fold and I'll lose 1/4 inch on all the stripe lengths. So 1/4 inch there, there, and there. But anyway, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, I always start with, obviously you can only sew one stripe on at a time. So I'm going to start with the flying skulls, and I'm going to kind of put it in between, in the middle of the denim stripe, because then that will give me the most space to play with. If it was a really short stripe, then I might angle it towards the bottom or the top, depending on how I want the layout. But this will be fine. And then I'm going to pause the video, and I'm going to go to my machine, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be a perfect quarter. Depending on the length of your stripe, you might want to go a little bit wider, you might want to go a little bit narrower, but you want it to be consistent across the entire stripe construction. The reason why is because if you cut the seam allowance too short, like if you're trying to really make a narrow stripe work, and you cut the seam allowance so it's like 1/8 of an inch or something like that, then when you press it flat, there's always going to be that little bulge on that stripe because the seam allowance is not able to lie flat. It's kind of, it's kind of curved, but there isn't enough of it to go flat. So that's why I always make the seam allowances for the stripe portions, as wide as I can, really, because I want to have the seam allowances on the underside almost touching, but not quite. So I want them to look a little bit like that, I guess. Because I know that the seam is going to press flat. It's not going to have like a weird bump, or it's not going to have any problems. It's just going to lie flat. The top stitch is going to look good. And when I post a picture of it, people are going to say, "Yo, that's fire, bro," instead of like, "Oh, that's a headband. Good job, kiddo. Is that your first one?" So, aim for excellence. So I'm going to go and do the stripes. And I'm going to do the first stripe first, and then I'm going to show you the next step, and we'll get back to it. All right, so I've sewn the seam on the Flying Skulls stripe, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange it so the Flying Skulls is the second stripe from the center, and let me just show you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it up so it looks a little bit like this. And then the template's going to be right there, so I'll hopefully get snake and those two skulls there if I play my cards right, which will be actually a little difficult, but I can do it. So it'll look like this. So now that I've got this stripe sewn, if you're absolutely interested in, like Oliver made a Flying Skulls headband for me a long time ago, where the skull on one panel meets the skull on the other panel, and it looks absolutely perfect. And I would assume, and I didn't ask him about this, but I would assume that he probably ironed everything every step of the way. So like a lot of times if I'm doing stripes and I've got lots of stripe length to play with and I'm not terribly interested in having one stripe match the other in terms of the design, then I can do all these steps at the machine. But if I want to make sure that the stripe is like perfectly aligned, then what I'll do is I'll take it to my ironing board and I'll just press the seam flat as I'd finish one stripe before I start the other stripe, because once that seam is flat, then I'll get a very accurate idea of what the stripe will look like. If I try to pin them together or clip them together and it's like this, I mean, who fucking knows? Because this stripe is going to lose 1/4 of an inch, this stripe is going to lose 1/4 of an inch, and that can shift where the stripes are in relation to each other, and it will also shift where the designs are in relation to each other. So for my purposes, I don't really care that much because I've got enough space that I'm basically just going to line them up so that the skulls and the snake are pretty much side by side, because that will give me a little bit of flexibility. And what I'm going to do, I'll show you another trick to that. Oh shit. Well, not a big deal. I'll show you another trick to that. So I'm going to arrange everything and I'm going to fold it over. So now I'm needing to clip my stripe in place. But check this out, boys and girls. When I use my Wonder clips, there are 2 lines on the bottom of the clips, and the second line is you guessed it, 1/4 of an inch. So if I put the stripe edge to the 1/4 of an inch, that will simulate what the seam will take up. And that is great for me visually because I can measure this shit all day with my quilting rulers and still screw up the placement just because, it's some people are very mathematically minded. They can kind of calculate out what the layout will look like based on the measurements, and everything goes out really well. I'm a very visual person and I need to see it to believe it. So when I use this clips like this, then that will simulate where the stripe seam will be. So then I can turn it around, and it's not it's not perfect because it's so narrow, but it kind of tells me that if the snake is towards the bottom of the panel, and I hope that you can see this, but if the snake is towards the bottom of the panel, then because of the diagonal, I should be able to line it up so I can get the template to cover, again, the skulls, the snake, part of it at least, and that would be cool. I think that people would be excited about that. So, great, but when I'm actually feeding it under the machine, I want to have the clips this way up because then they don't get caught up in the bed because my machine doesn't sit perfectly flush on the table. So let's do that. So again, I'm going to sew the seam, and then I'm going to press it, and then I will show it to you before I top stitch it and then after I top stitch it. Okay, so I've pressed out one of the stripes and I just want to show you what I've done. So I've sewn, both of the seams look like this. It's 1/4 of an inch from the edge. They're even on both sides because I use a metal swing down seam guide on my machine. It's really the only time that I use a guide, but I absolutely love using it for this purpose, and also sewing the bottoms of the panels together, just because when you get accurate seams like that, then it makes your template a lot more accurate as well. Anyway, so this seam right here I have pressed flat, and this seam I have not. I just wanted to show you the difference before I go and press this seam as well, so then it will be sitting flush on the table, and the stripes won't have like a 3D look or anything like that because they are sewn in between the fabric as opposed to on top of it. Okay, so before I top stitch it, let's see whether I will be able to get the placement that I want. Obviously, again, it's not going to be totally accurate, but it'll at least give me an idea if I'm on the right track or I need to do something over again. So let's pretend that the stripes are like this. And again, I am going to make sure that the interesting parts of the details are, above where the bottom seam will be. And yeah, that's going to be cool. So I'm hopefully going to get the two skulls. Obviously that skull will be a lot smaller because it's got the seam in it. This skull will be a lot smaller as well. The snake will be a lot smaller, but in terms of what we can do with what we've got, I think it's going to be as good a placement as I could do. I could move it down a little bit lower to get the trademark in there as well, but I don't care. Okay, so I've pressed it flat, and I'll just show you the back. Seams are very even. I might repress that one again. That's a little puffy still. You want the seam to be flat. You don't want it to be puffy or just like folded over. You really want to spend time doing this. So like for this situation like this with these stripes, I definitely encourage you not to drag the iron. I know that it's an easy habit to slip into. You just want to press and hold that sucker right there. And then if you have a tailor's clapper, which is that, it's a piece of wood basically, then you can press and hold and sort of warm up the fabric, and then you take the iron away, and then you put the tailor's clapper down on it and just, what did I say in the last video? Press with all your might. Just because the flatter the stripe seams are when you're feeding it under the machine, the neater the top stitch is going to be. You know, I've got industrial sewing machines, so they can sew through a lot, but even so, if I screw up the ironing of the stripe on the underside, it affects the top side. Like you can see that the stitch is not quite as even, or it just looks screwed up. Now, obviously the edges are going to be difficult to sew neatly because there's no fabric butting up against the edge of this stripe, for example, to keep it in shape. So my top stitch focus is going to be where the stripes meet. I'll start on the outside of the stripe, but it's not going to be a priority to me because there's just no way to make that look as good as it's going to look, you know, through the body of the stripe, if that makes any sense. And also there's really no point because that stripe is going to be cut off anyway. So don't waste a lot of time making neat top stitch in the areas that you're going to cut away. You know, just focus on the areas that will be overlapping with the other stripes because those are areas that are actually going to be sewn into the panel. Anyway, let's get to it. Alright guys, so I've got the stripe top stitched. I've got, there's a top stitch line there, there, and there. Obviously there'll be a top stitch line at this edge and this edge when I join it to the panels. But let me just show you what it looks like on the underside. So that's a little messy. But the seams are straight. Everything has been back tacked, so the seams and the stripes themselves are not going to loosen. Obviously we'll get to that in a second, so I'm not going to even say anything. But everything is straight. It's really easy to sew when the seams are straight because you're basically just feeding, you know, 5-6 inch piece of fabric straight into the machine. So as long as you go slowly, you can make the lines pretty neat without paying a lot of attention to it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip it into where I want it to be on this panel. And again, like we've already discussed 1,000 times, I need to account for the fact that there is going to be a seam running 1/4 of an inch on the bottom. So I don't want to put the skulls too high because then I won't be able to see them. So I'm going to move them down a little bit, like so. I'm actually going to put the snake so it a little bit hangs below because there's no way to have the entire snake and the skulls in it. And I think that the skulls are the most recognizable details, so that's what people will want to see, not see you. So with that said, I'm just going to line it up and I'm going to just clip it. There's still plenty of time to move things around if I need to, so this is not the most critical part of putting in the stripes, even if I was concerned with placement. Sewing it to one side of the panel is not going to make a huge difference because you can always shift the second panel in relation, as long as it's wide enough. Like I said, this is a 4-inch piece of denim, so I've done that on purpose so I can move the template up, I can move it down, I can move it side, I can move it side. Because it's better to start out with loose measurements, especially when you're starting out making stripes. If you've never done a stripe like this, if you start with a wider panel, then you'll be a lot happier. If you start with like the same panel that you've been using to make headbands, and it is just barely big enough for the template, and you do that to save fabric, and you feel like it's good for the environment and it's good for your fabric collection, that's great. But it is going to be frustrating to start doing seams like this because there are lots of measurements that you're not necessarily used to having to take account of. So that's just my personal opinion. Do what you want, but a wise man once told me, fuck the fabric. That was Oliver. Oliver said that. What a guy. What a champ. Man of the people. Waste the fabric if it helps you make a better template. Okay, so a couple of steps that I did. I sewed the stripe piece to this panel, and then I pressed it pretty flat. Not like a hammer flat, but pretty flat. And the reason why I did that is because what I want to do now is I want to get some clips ready, and I want to line it up so this panel on this side matches up with this panel on this side in terms of the bottom line, because that's where I'm going to be using as a guide to sew the panels together. So it is important for me to have a straight, even line on the bottom of the panel. So there's a few different ways to do this. And this is kind of confusing, again, if you've never done seams like this before, because what you have to do is you have to offset one of the panels, because when you butterfly the seam open, then it will shift the panel in relation to the other panel down or up. Let me show you what I mean by that. So if I line it up like this, and I'm like, oh cool, that's where that piece meets and that's where that piece meets, let's just fold that sucker over right there. So again, this is a 4-inch, so I'm just gonna fold it over right there, because I'm like, no big deal. The panels line up, that's where this seam touches, that's where that seam touches. Very cool. But check this out, my fellow Americans and non-Americans. This is what's going to happen. You're like, I've lined it up perfectly tight. And then you flip it over, and you can see, if you look at it from the bottom, that this panel is significantly lower. It's about ½ an inch lower. So that's going to be really frustrating, because then that means that what you're going to have to do is, if you sew this in like this, you're going to have to redraw a straight line on this side, and you're going to cut away this panel. And if you have a wide enough panel and you don't mind spending the extra time, then go for it. But I want to get it as accurately as possible in the initial steps, because that's going to save me time. So I know that I need to offset this panel. I need to make it significantly higher. And I'm going to show you a trick to this. So what I'm doing, let's start again. So I've got my bottom line like this, and I'm just going to offset it by raising it up by about, let's start with 1/4 inch roughly. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the 1/4 inch seam guide line on the bottom of my clip. Whoops, that didn't make it through. And I'm just going to, this part takes me a while, because I want to save time on the machine, because I don't want to have to unpick seams, I don't want to have to redraw the template lines. I just want to spend the time to get it right first, and then I don't have to do it again. So I've offset it a little bit less than 1/4 inch. Let's see how close we are. And in order to see how close we are, obviously I can't hold it like this, because that's not going to be accurate. So you just flip it upside down. And ta-da! Now again, that seam is not going to line up with that seam, but that's okay, because that's the top of the panel. That's not going to be shown in the template. What we're concerned with is this line on the bottom. So if I hold it up to a straight line, I can see, holy shit team, that's gonna be perfect. So this, it's not gonna be like electron microscope perfect necessarily, but it's not gonna make a difference when I'm feeding it onto the machine, because I'm going to have that seam allowance, and it's just not going to show up as an issue in the final product. So I still need to reclip these, because these seams aren't lining up. But in terms of the placement between this panel and the stripe panel, it's perfect. It's as perfect as I would want it to be. So let me reclip this and sew it, and then press it, and then top stitch it, and then there's a couple other things that I want to show you, and that'll be it. All right, guys. So one final thing that I will suggest is grab a pen so it'll actually show up. So there is one issue with the way that I kind of sewed all of the stripes at different lengths like this. There is no like single area where all of the top stitching is finished, because I did the stripe piece by itself before I attached it to the panels, so I couldn't see exactly at that point where the panel bottom would be. So that means that if I just cut this straight across and put my panels together and make the rest of the headband, that means that this top stitch right here doesn't have any back tack, this one doesn't, this one doesn't, this one doesn't, and just those ones. But still, if I don't secure those lines somehow, then that means that when I cut the fabric off, those stitches could come loose, and conceivably, as I'm feeding it under the machine to attach the front panel to the back panel, you know, if the stitches don't hold that top stitch secure, then I would never know about it until I flip the thing around or I make the rest of the headband, and then I'm, you know, pressing it or whatever, and the stitches are literally coming loose on the stripes, and by then it's a real headache to have to undo everything to fix those lines. So what I want to do is I want to preemptively secure them, and the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to draw a line from the bottom of one panel to the other, and I'm just going to draw a template or a little stitch line right here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to secure all of these stitches by following this line with my presser foot, and I usually do like 1/8 of an inch, so it's not going to be, this stitch line is not going to be visible in the final headband, and it's not going to affect the way that the headband press, or like the way that the panels press together or anything like that, because it's just the one panel and I haven't attached it to the other one yet. So it's not going to do anything, except it is going to secure all of these top stitch lines just in case one of them loosens when I slice off the excess fabric. So I'm going to use about a 2.5 millimeter stitch, so it's going to be a very fine stitch because I want to be sure that it actually gets all of those top stitch lines correctly. So I'm going to go and do that, and then I will show you. Alright guys, I hope this has been helpful. This is what we've got to work with. This is our front panel, obviously, and if I just lay it out just to see, hopefully with the template, again, roughly 1/4 of an inch up from the bottom seam or the bottom edge of the fabric, then I have a pretty good placement. I'm pretty happy with that because the skull will be visible, part of the snake, and actually I'll probably get a little bit of that trademark in there as well. Or I could shift it up and then I could just trim the excess from the bottom. So, you know, like I said before, if you start with larger stripes and larger panels than you need, then it gives you a little bit of space to move around. If you start with like measuring just this diagonal line on your template and you're like, oh, well, it's only like 2.5 inches, no big deal. It is going to be frustrating for you to line everything up because there are lots of different seams that you have to take into account that will shrink the pieces together. And, you know, lots of variables that you might not be used to taking into account. So I've been making these striped headbands for a little while now, and I still use 5 to 6 inches length on the stripe, 4 inches on the panel, and you can see obviously by the way that the template is sitting on the panel, yeah, there's going to be some waste. It happens. But I'm okay with the waste because then it's still a time saver to me, because then I don't have to go back over and redo parts that didn't line up nicely or not to be, didn't line up as the way I wanted them. So obviously the Coyote could have been shorter. I just used that because this is like the last of this particular scrap that I had. And whether I cut it down to be smaller or not, there's not a whole lot that I could do with that. So that one is an especially long stripe. Normally I don't do them that long. I'd say that the Flying Skulls is probably about average for the length of the stripe that I use. I'm not afraid of wasting a little bit of fabric. I don't waste a lot of fabric, but I've got a big pile of scraps next to me so I can grab pieces for the center stripe. But if you start big, then it's easier for you to figure out like what lengths actually work well for you and what lengths you need. If you start too small, then you're apt to waste a lot more fabric because you don't necessarily know what the finished product is going to look like, and you don't know what to expect when you're clipping things together and then sewing the seams together, and you're like, well, this is not turning out how I wanted it to, and you've already cut 3-inch stripes, so you have to kind of make use of them. Obviously the panels are easier to line up if you do vertical stripes, because the panels are not, like, the stripes are getting smaller and the panels are getting closer together, but the vertical movement between the stripes is not moving, and the vertical movement between the panels is not moving. So sometimes I've done vertical stripes, but seems like all the cool kids want diagonal stripes, so hope that helps.